without any further ado, yep, it looks like it is good to start. So thank you all very much for joining us today. We're hoping to spread a little holiday cheer this afternoon as we explore some of the forgotten treats and spirited beverages. And I do need spirited. Robert has prepared some very interesting drinks for us today. As I mentioned, we will be sampling and reviewing these items and letting you know if they are better left in Christmases past, or maybe it's something that we should renew for the holidays. So joining me in the merriment today, I'd like to formally introduce our facilities coordinator and resident sommelier, Robert Barron, and one of our longtime volunteers and an all-around very lovely person, Janet Austin. So before we get started, I also do want to mention again that we are trying to make this program as conversational as possible, even though, you know, not everyone can be together this holiday season. It's great to try to create a festive environment. So again, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please feel free to drop those in the Q&A box or in the chat box on Zoom or in the comment section on Facebook. And we'll be checking those throughout the program. Robert, Janet, do you guys have anything you want to add?
No.
Ready to go. So you might all be wondering today, what exactly is on the menu? Well, we actually have 5 food and drink items that we're planning on discussing and sampling and rating for you today, which are mentioned in the following songs and stories. So we'll begin our afternoon with a little beverage and a song with Here We Come a Wassailing. Is it wassailing or wassailing?
I've heard it both.
Both ways.
I think wassailing is more the English and wassailing is what we've turned it into.
Gotcha. So we'll come up with a determination of what exactly we want to call it by the end.
Perhaps the more wassail you drink, the better you pronounce it. I'm not
That's
sure.
true. The more interesting the pronunciations become. Then we'll stop for a little snack of sugar plums while we receive a visit from St. Nicholas. We'll discuss the holiday ghost story, very interesting ghost story, infamous ghost story, A Christmas Carol over a glass of smoking bishop. Then we'll head off over the river and through the woods for a stop at grandmother's house for a slice of pie. And lastly, we'll then wish you all a very Merry Christmas while demanding our last dish of the day, a figgy or Christmas pudding. So now I'm going to pass things over to Robert, who's going to share with us a little bit of the history behind the song, Here We Come a Wassailing, and explain to us what exactly is wassail.
All right, thanks, Jenny. So it's really interesting. Both the drinks we're going to be having today are very straight and to the point on where they came from. So wassail actually is an Anglo-Saxon kind of tradition. It was a drink that was made either to celebrate the new year or Christmas Eve. What would happen is they would brew this cider. It was not hard cider, it was just apple cider. Brew it with all kinds of citrus fruits and then add a bunch of lovely spices to it. And basically it's almost like mulled wine made the same way, just over a low heat until it starts to kind of steam. And they would sit around sing all kinds of Christmas carols. The one you see here, the wassailing song. I'm going to try to say that right through this whole thing. The wassailing song, but it also had another tradition. What they would do is on Christmas Eve, more so in England, they would actually go to the apple orchards. And obviously apples have already been done, you know, they're a fall fruit. So they would go into the apple orchards dressed in very Victorian garb, and they would sing this song as loud as they possibly could while drinking the wassail. And what that was supposed to do was 2 things. Any spirits that were in the trees that were going to cause a bad future harvest would be scared away. So I can only imagine they probably weren't the best singers in the world, but it also would, in what they said, would enter the trees and guarantee a good harvest of apples for the next year. So they would, this is a great photograph here from a London publication of they call it Father Christmas in a wassail bowl. And on our next picture here, you'll actually see what a traditional wassail bowl looks like. They are gigantic and they are huge because there'd be 50, 100 people. So they have these gigantic things that hold 10 gallons of wassail in them. But yeah, it's a really simple history. It's a really fun. And what's really great about this particular beverage is if you have people that can't drink alcohol, that's great because it actually doesn't have alcohol in it until you spike it with brandy. So, you know, one of my colleagues here doesn't drink, so she was able to actually try it without it. So it's good both ways. So that's the pretty much brief and short history of wassail. And you can actually go on YouTube and look up the wassail song. And this is how you present the drink, with a cinnamon stick, an apple slice, and a fresh grate of nutmeg over the top. Again, if you get a chance, definitely go listen to the wassail song on YouTube. It's absolutely super fun, and it actually sounds like you're trampling through the woods, which is great. So, and now Jenny's favorite part, we get to taste everything, right?
Yeah, this is always kind of the amusing part of these types of programs. So could you describe again what seasonings are in here, what flavors are in here again, Robert?
So this one has it has cinnamon, it has nutmeg, it has ginger and allspice. It has lemon juice, orange juice, apple cider, not apple juice. Apple juice is a bit too sweet. And again, you just gently bring it up to a simmer. And then once it gets to a simmer, you hold it at 20 minutes and there's your wassail.
Wow. I think it's
I think we should say cheers if we're having a
that's true.
cheers.
I just jumped the gun and just started sipping. So cheers, everyone. Absolutely. It's tart.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit on the tart side. Normally I'm not a fan of hot alcoholic beverages, but the brandy in here is very subtle. So I think it's very easy to sip on. It doesn't kind of punch you in the face.
I did find something really interesting when making this. So the oranges I used were extremely sweet. And when you heat them up, they lose that sweetness. So I think, and then it has a half a cup of fresh lemon juice in it. So I think that also adds to it as well. Gotcha.
Okay, so it's what helps to kind of create a little bit more of that tart, bitter.
Yeah, it's actually really nice. I can imagine being very cold outside in the snow and drinking this and feeling really good. I dropped the apple slice in it, and it's absolutely lovely. But it's got some body to it, which is really nice.
Yeah.
I thought when I initially saw the recipe, I thought it was going to be thin and kind of watery. It's actually got quite a bit of flavor, and the fresh nutmeg really kicks it off nicely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't find it too tart at all. I think it's quite spicy, but I think it's delicious.
I can see why they would go around, asking for this or sharing cups of this around the harvest time or around the Christmas tide to be able to feast together. It's a nice beverage. I don't mind it at all.
And Janet and I were having this conversation. Would they use hard cider? I'm wondering, Janet, in England, I know they press apples and store it. Maybe some of the cider might have turned hard when they made it.
The part of England I come from grows a lot of apples and is famous for apple cider, but definitely it's mostly hard cider that people drink. So I would have expected it to be made with that.
That's why we helped it along.
And that's also what's really nice, because you just kind of spike it to the level that you'd like. Either
yes.
you can do it without.
Yeah.
So for young ones or those that don't drink, it still has a great flavor to it when you don't necessarily want to consume.
I think on a cold winter evening, this would be very nice to sip on.
Yeah, it is very much like a hot apple cider, except
it is
more
very much like
hot.
it. Yes.
Yeah.
And it did, the tip anytime a recipe says spike, they're talking about 1.5 ounces of alcohol. I actually dialed this back a little bit when we did a pre-test on it, and we all agreed it did nothing. The minute I bumped it up to that 1.5 ounces, now it rounded it out really nicely.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Very nice.
I think that's great. Thank you so much, Robert.
Yeah.
That was our first little taste. Now we're going to take you to a land of sugar plums. This particular tasting element is something that's long been, I think, a mystery for a lot of people. I know it was something that I thought I had an idea of what it was, but it turned out being something kind of completely different. So the lines that you see on the screen here come from the opening of "Twas the Night Before Christmas," as it's commonly known. "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care, in hopes that St. Nicholas soon would be there. The children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads." Now, this poem, which actually is officially titled "An Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas," but it became formally known as "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." I think that drink is already working, Robert. It's probably one of the most famous Christmas poems ever written. It was actually first published anonymously in 1823. Which I was kind of surprised by. Its assumed writer, Clement Clark Moore, this is a picture of Mr. Moore, kind of a stern-looking fellow, actually didn't claim authorship of this memorable verse until 1837, so some 14 years later. And I think the reason for that was because Moore was actually a professor of Greek literature, as well as divinity and biblical learning at this is a very fancy school, the General Theological Seminary of the Protestant Episcopal Church in New York. And it seems that he didn't really want his name associated with something that he considered a trifle, is what he called it, since he had written it for his very young children at the time. And being a more scholarly academic, he didn't, I think, want to be known for writing this little poem about Santa Claus. So that led me to wonder, like, how did the poem then actually get published? Well, it seems that it was first published in a Troy, New York newspaper called the Sentinel. It was published on December 23rd, 1823, and it had supposedly been sent there by a friend of Moore. And it really took off after the first printing, and so they were reprinting it year after year with no name attached. And so, it wasn't until 1837 that Moore, it was first attributed to Moore in print. But it wasn't until 1844 that Moore officially acknowledges himself as the author of the poem, when he actually included it in his own little book of poems that he was having published. And it was really his children, who were then grown at the time, but still thought, you need to include this in that book of poems, because it was such a magical story for them. So Moore's description of Santa Claus, or St. Nicholas, as he was still being called, really kind of set the standard of how we would envision the jolly little elf for decades to come. But it wasn't entirely his idea. Moore actually borrowed pretty heavily from his friend Washington Irving, who might be better known as the author of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So not exactly what you think of when you think of Christmas, is an entirely different holiday. But Irving had written a book called Knickerbocker's History of New York in 1809. And it is the first time that Santa Claus is kind of mentioned in America. And he really introduces this idea to the American public, even though it was already kind of familiar with the Dutch settlers. And so he writes in Knickerbocker's History of New York about this St. Nicholas coming to visit a very real person, Olaf van Kortlandt, who was one of the first of the Dutch colonizers of Manhattan in 1637. He, in that story, says that St. Nicholas flew down to Van Kortlandt and told him what New York could be. And so it seems that Moore kind of kept that idea of Santa arriving on a flying wagon. He also smokes a pipe in the story when he's talking to Van Kortlandt. He describes him as being kind of small in stature, and also the whole touching the side of his nose before he disappears. So those elements were parts of the story that Moore incorporated into his version of St. Nicholas. But he also did something very, very different, very important, because in the Dutch tradition, St. Nicholas appears on Christmas Day, but it was more that had St. Nicholas arrive on Christmas Eve rather than Christmas Day. And the reason for that was because Christmas Day in the 1820s, 1830s was beginning to overtake New Year's Day as kind of the preferred family holiday. Before that, it was really families getting together on New Year's Day. And the Protestants didn't like this. They were actually very anti these loud, boisterous celebrations on Christmas Day. And so to kind of navigate this, he had Santa arriving on on Christmas Eve to then kind of make it more of a child-focused holiday. So that was something that kind of really helped people in New York and then later across America to kind of embrace this idea of Santa as being not necessarily associated with one particular religion, but just a very charismatic and selfless person who arrives on Christmas Eve to bring gifts to good boys and girls across the world. So even though Moore's poem kind of popularized many of the myths around Santa Claus, it does reference that thing, the sugar plum, that has really fallen out of popularity. And even by the late 19th century, I don't think most people knew what a real sugar plum was. So it turns out, when I was doing my research, that the term actually applied to any, what they call the confection, that had a hard sugar shell. So that kind of surrounded like a nut, a seed, a spice, or even bark. So you might want to think of things like a Jordan almond. That's really something that is more associated with what a sugar plum was. Or that licorice candy, the Good and Plenties. I don't like those. Those are gross. But some people really like black licorice though. But now when you're eating them, you can think this is more in line with a traditional sugar plum. The process of making these shelled candies is called panning. So this is an image of a dragée pan. And it was a very lengthy process because you would add in the nut or seeds and it would have to turn while you're adding in a sugar syrup. And that's what's putting on the layers of candy. And since it's open, it cools as it's going in. So it's creating those layers of shell. It was very expensive to have these candies. So it was meant, for upper classes of society to consume. And when they developed more mechanical means, it became much more simpler to create these things. So the treats became a bit more inexpensive. Now, I have to say, I was pretty disappointed when I discovered what sugar plums actually were. When I heard the poem as a kid and the line, "While visions of sugar plums danced in their heads," Jordan almonds weren't what I was picturing. In my memory, it seemed that artists always illustrated that scene with sleeping children kind of dreaming of these sparkly, chewy treats. And I always thought of something more gumdrop-like, or, just something that had some texture to it, because I don't know when the last time anybody ate a Jordan almond, but you can't just bite into that. So when I started kind of trying to find a recipe for sugar plums, I feel like the internet really agreed with me that they didn't think of a Jordan almond or a peanut M&M as a sugar plum. And I came across hundreds of these authentic recipes that called for dried fruit and spice, these dried fruit and spice mixtures kind of made into balls, which is what you see here, kind of covered in sugar. And I see that, these do feel more like a holiday treat, which is nice. But it does seem that this particular set of recipes that you'll see everybody stating as an authentic sugar plum recipe was actually developed in the 1960s by a food writer by the name of Mimi Sheridan. And she might have been using a much, much older cookbook, first published in 1609, titled Delights for Ladies, where she describes boiling plums with sugar as a means of preserving them. And so that might have been where the title sugar plum or sugared plums come from. But this is what now most people make, and the flavor of sugar plum that you see advertised is more along the lines of these little bites versus what a true sugar plum is. Now, before we sample, I do have one final twist on all of this. It is quite possible that Moore wasn't actually talking about any sweets at all. Because the term sugar plum took on, again, different meanings by the 19th century and could have been used to indicate anything sweet or happy. So those children might have been just having good dreams or sweet dreams instead of actually dreaming of candy. But because this program is about actually tasting treats, I didn't want to bring in a bag of Jordan almonds. And I sure as heck wasn't going to try and make something like that. So I turned to one of the authentic sugar plum recipes that we can sample now, and you guys can give me your thoughts on. So this is actually a mixture of dried fruits. There's fig, there is prunes in it. There's also cinnamon and cardamom and ginger, as well as nutmeg, walnuts and almonds and honey. So it's all mixed together and left to dry and rolled in sugar. So taste it and see what you think.
Sounds great. And Jenny, when I get to my presentation, I found out that the word plum actually meant raisins back in pre-Victorian days. So maybe the plums never meant plums with these either.
Quite possibly. One of the theories is that actually the term sugared plums for these candies, these hard-shelled candies, were because they were larger and circular. So again, it was something in that shape of a plum that led to that idea.
That's great. It's delicious.
Do you like it?
Yes.
You like it, Robert?
It's really cool. It's this really great balance between, like, there's a tiny bit of savoriness in there, but then you get the bitterness of the the fruit, plus a little bit of sweetness. It's like this really cool, like, umami thing. It's great.
I was kind of, when I first tried it, because I made these yesterday, and when I first tried it, I was a little ambivalent about it. I was just like, I don't know if I like these. But I saw on one of the other sites that these are kind of like fruitcake, where it's supposed to get better as it ages. So maybe by the end of Christmas, these will be a bit tastier.
No, I think it's very tasty now.
Don't hate on the sugar plums. They're really
Don't
good.
hate on the sugar plums. Okay. Okay. I should also mention, if anybody's interested in trying these recipes themselves, it is on, they are on our website, Homestead Museum, all one word, .org. Also, a link will be sent to you if you're attending on Zoom, so you can have access to all the recipes that we are sampling today. And with that, as we kind of set aside our sugar plums, I'm ready for another holiday story. So I'm going to turn it back over to Robert, who's going to tell us a bit more about smoking bishop and what it has to do with A Christmas Carol.
Not a bishop smoking a cigar, I promise. All right, so basically this drink, it's basically mulled wine, but it gained its popularity and its name because of Dickens' Christmas Carol. So we have a little excerpt from the book here. I'll read it for you in case you're not on video with us. "A Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge with an earnestness that could not be mistaken as he clapped him on the back. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family as we discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob." So that's where it gets its popularity from. But this actually goes back, I don't think it was quite as complex, but basically this originates from the monasteries over in once again, England, where a lot of the, I just lost my train of thought, monks, thank you, would basically, they made wines. And obviously it gets very cold. They lived very simple lives. So it got very cold, and they would mull these wines so that they could drink them during the winter times. What was really interesting about this recipe is that it originally called for something called Seville oranges, which came from Spain. We, due to a lot of reasons right now, cannot get Seville oranges. So I was able to use navel oranges instead, and it worked just as well. But you basically have to bake the oranges with cloves that have been studded in them. We have some photographs of that for sure coming up. But they would serve it in something. Oh, sorry, Jenny. Back. Go. They would basically stud the oranges. You make a little piercing, stud the oranges with the cloves, and then you bake them at a 350 for about 90 minutes, and they start to get nice and brown, which you'll see in the next picture. They're fantastic, but what was really weird, I was telling Jenny, as they sat, they began to ash over. And my wife actually thought, oh, they're molding. I said, no, it's just some weird thing that happened. So you basically put all this wine together, and this one you don't spike because obviously it already has the wine, but you're also going to add an entire bottle of ruby port, which is really high in alcohol. It's about 24% alcohol. So, and you don't boil it. So really the alcohol does not boil off. I will suggest when you make this recipe, do not buy your $20 or $30 or $40 bottle of red wine to make this. Buy the $4, $5, Sutter Home Behringer Merlot. Merlot works best for this because it tends to be a little bit sweeter. The other reason it gets the name Smoking Bishop is because the bishops had a mitre, which is a hat that, or a kind of hat that they would wear. I don't think it looks like it, but this is a bowl that they would serve the smoking bishop in. And if you turn it upside down, it's supposed to resemble the mitre that a bishop would wear. Again, I think it's just a really interesting take on mulled wine. And once you bake all those oranges, you squeeze that baked orange juice into the actual wine. And it has a little bit of brown sugar. Again, fresh ginger, which is really fun. Allspice, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. So I know how much Jenny loves hot red wine, so I can't wait to see how she's going to like this one. It's this one is very different than the first one we had for sure.
So here's our glass of Smoking Bishop. I like the I almost wonder if you could drop the peel with the cloves into it and just kind of let it.
Yeah, that's what I feel. You should drop it in too, so that it flavors it.
So it gets a little extra,
plenty of
something in there.
Ready.
They also, one of the other things is some people also still call it the Smoking Bishop because that's when you know it's done. When you start to see the steam come off of the actual mold concoction you have, that's why they also called it Smoking Bishop.
So Alex says it's a very pretty garnish.
Yes, I think it is too.
Well, and also thinking, because you often hear, especially during the Victorian era, how oranges are such a treat for people. And so getting an orange in your Christmas stocking, I mean, that was still a big deal. I think my grandparents grew up in the Midwest, and before they all headed out to California, it was still a Christmas treat to get a stock in your stocking, an orange, because it was such a rarity, I guess, in so many parts. So I can see, garnishing something with oranges, but also kind of symbolize where you are in society if you have access to these things.
I remember as a child, we had relatives that lived in Florida, and they would send us these very fancy oranges in crates for every Christmas, and didn't have the heart to tell them that we live in California where we get oranges all year long.
Yeah, Jennifer just wrote that, her grandparents too, we still do Christmas oranges. So it's traditions that have continued on.
Well, and
so, okay, I'm
tangerines now, I guess, which is maybe a follow-up to oranges.
Yeah, except, well, it's a little easy. You don't have to weigh down
the stocking. In a stocking.
All right.
Very nice.
It's
interesting.
It's not bad. It's not bad. Not bad by any means. It's just, I don't know. It's like a warm sangria.
It's very.
Yeah, I think it is.
So one thing I was telling Janet and Jenny before we started the Zoom today was I was really surprised that they use ruby port in this because it's so high in alcohol and it's very austere. So I think if I was to change one thing about it, I would move on to like a 10-year port, which is only a couple dollars more. It's a little bit sweeter, a little more body to it, and it would knock down some of that alcoholiness of the beverage.
Yes.
But it also has a half a cup of brown sugar in it, so you would think it would be sweeter. But I think the minute you add those roasted orange juice to it, it just, you know, really makes it, it's to me very austere, you know, and I can definitely tell there's a lot of alcohol in it. It's what we refer to as hot.
Yeah. Yeah, it does have a lot of alcohol in it. And so, I mean, again, I can see, you know, sitting at a Christmas party for the holidays or by the fire, you know, something like this would be very festive. It is a little drying on the mouth.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's also to encourage more drinking.
Well, I think it's also, Jenny, I don't know if you agree with me. It definitely smells way better than it tastes.
Yes, I do like the smell of it because I think you get the orange definitely hits first. So a question just came in, Robert. Did you try the roasted orange juice on its own? I wonder if it makes a big difference in the flavor of the beverage.
So yeah, funny, something else we talked about before. Yeah, I was able to squeeze, like I had hit 5 oranges, and my son and wife both tried it, and they were like, wow, that's really, really, really good. So it definitely, it has this kind of nutty flavor to it, which is kind of fun. And it also had like a very spicy flavor to it, even though you only put 5 little cloves in these big oranges. But no, it's quite good. I would almost say, you know, roast your oranges and juice them. They're actually quite good.
Someone also commented that the garnish looks a little like a turkey, and I can see it now with the way it was placed in there. So it could be used for multiple holidays as well.
So I imagine.
I don't think we intended it to look like a turkey, did we?
No.
So I imagine he was able to negotiate very well with Bob Cratchit over an entire bowl of this.
Yes.
Absolutely. Scrooge, well, by that time in the story, he is feeling very generous.
True.
But I can see why, you know, something like this being shared, especially because we were talking a little bit earlier, Janet, and you had also mentioned, you know, the amount of spices in a lot of these beverages. You know, it definitely, again, is a sign of class.
Yes.
Being able to have access to these things as they're also newly being introduced to England because of the various colonies throughout the world that England has at this time.
And if you do make this recipe, there is a bit of a shortcut you can use. If you want to cheat a little bit, instead of going out and buying all those spices, you can just buy a bag of mulling spices and drop it in, and it'll work just about the same way.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a good tip. That way, if you don't want to buy everything separately. Well, and I guess it's also a flavor profile that you can kind of adjust to pretty easily. So if you like a little bit, you know, more of one particular spice over another, you can really just make it to your own taste, which is really nice.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Robert, for our smoking bishop. And now we're heading off over the river and through the woods for another popular kind of holiday song that was often taught to school children. I actually have a very fond memory of this myself when my nephew, who is now in his 20s, was very little and he was somewhat shy. And after a family get together, he had just learned the song in school. So he was about 5 or 6 years old, and he like stood on his tiptoes and he like strained his neck as he began singing "Over the River and Through the Woods to Grandmother's House We Go." And it's something I think that we think of as being a just kind of typical holiday song that is taught to school children. This is how the lyrics actually end for the song as we know it. Over the river and through the woods, now grandmother's cap I spy. Hurrah for the fun, is the pudding done? Hurrah for the pumpkin pie. Now, what always kind of struck me about that was I always think of pumpkin pie as a Thanksgiving item. I know many families still have pumpkin pie at Christmas, but I always associate it more with Thanksgiving. And when I began looking at kind of the history of this song, I also discovered that it was actually a poem first. And it has 12 stanzas to it. So it is much longer than the song is taught today. And it was actually written by this woman. Her name was Lydia Maria Child, and it was set to music much later on. And it was also when it was set to music that the holiday changed, because the original title of this poem was not Over the River and Through the Woods. It was the New England Boys' Song About Thanksgiving Day. So it makes a little bit more sense that pumpkin pie is mentioned. But I guess when it was set to music, that was also changed to Christmas Day. So that's how it's always been taught in America. Now, pumpkin pie is actually also, I realize, mentioned in several Christmas songs. So you might remember There's No Place Like Home for the holidays. They mention it, Sleigh Ride, even Rocking Around the Christmas Tree, which all of these songs were written in the 1950s, all mention pumpkin pie. So I guess it's still something that continued on. Now, I was also taken surprise by the woman who penned this poem, because Lydia Maria Child, though she's not a household name today, she was actually one of the 19th century's most popular American writers. Not just female writers, American writers. And she was actually an outspoken supporter of abolitionism, racial justice, and women's rights, as well as Native American rights. Her writing career was actually very severely damaged in 1833 when she published an appeal in favor of that class of Americans called African. It was really the first kind of full-scale analysis of race and slavery in the United States and its impacts. And it called for the immediate abolition of slavery, for the freeing of slaves without any recompense to the former slave owners. There was a large public outcry about this particular book. At the same time, she was publishing a children's magazine, which was kind of the first of its kind in the United States, called Juvenile Miscellany. That was forced to close. Her books were no longer being sold. She had, by that time, also written several historical fiction novels, as well as a cookbook called The Frugal Housewife. So she was a very prolific writer in lots of different genres. But she remained undaunted, which I was very interested by. She continued her abolitionist work, eventually leaving Massachusetts, where she had grown up, and headed to New York City to become the editor of the National Anti-Slavery Standard, which was the newspaper for the American Anti-Slavery Society. And she just kept at it over the next decade. And she eventually left the Standard and was able to kind of revive her literary career. But she was able to kind of get to a point eventually where her letters, her stories, she was publishing newspaper columns once again and writing children's books as well as adult fiction books. In 1844 is when she published a collection of poetry for children called Flowers for Children, where this poem, The New England Boys' Song, first appears. And one of the things that kind of struck me, if you look through that collection, is that even though this particular song is very joyous and it's upbeat throughout the whole 12 stanzas about traveling, actually also original to grandfather's house instead of grandmother's, but grandmother does appear at the end, is that it's kind of tempered by these other pieces that address issues such as poverty and racism. So she was still continuing on this particular direction. The one kind of disappointing thing I feel is that by the time this poem kind of enters in as a standard in a lot of classrooms, her social vision for society was being obscured, and she was no longer really remembered as this outspoken rights activist, as well as being a very prolific writer. She's kind of just known as this woman who penned this very sweet song, you know, about Thanksgiving. But one of the interesting things about this, which I thought was kind of neat, was that actually, even though she mentions pumpkin pie in this particular poem, pumpkin pie hasn't always been a big part of Thanksgiving. There was a time when squash pie was poised to kind of become that ubiquitous holiday dessert. Squash pie, like setting aside a day to give thanks or Thanksgiving, has actually been a New England tradition for quite some time. And many New England cooks and writers like Henry Ward Beecher, another outspoken abolitionist, as well as a one-time New England transplant, Mark Twain, actually wrote columns about praising kind of the delicate flavors of squash pie. Pies like made from these kinds of squashes. This is a blue Hubbard, not exactly what you think of when you think, you know, cute little holiday fall gourd, or the Boston marrow. These were the kind of commercially sold squashes in the New England area since the early 1800s. These were much more preferred over pumpkin because pumpkin's really stringy. So it's not necessarily a great cooking squash. But I think they would have also done something pretty different to Child's poem, because I don't think it would have the same ring to it if it ended with hurrah for the squash pie instead of the pumpkin. So what I decided to do is I decided, instead of making a traditional pumpkin pie, which we've all tasted before, I thought I would make a squash pie. So I actually used a pie recipe from another program that we have done before. We did a program last year called Everything But the Turkey, where we were introduced to cookbook author Jessie Marie DeBoth, who is very interesting in her own right. You can actually check out that particular program in our programs archive on our website, as well as on our YouTube channel. When I was researching the squash pie that she recommends, I discovered that really pumpkin takes over as the pie of choice in 1929, when the canned food manufacturer Libby's introduces canned pumpkin to grocery stores. And they did a really smart marketing tactic. On every label of this canned pumpkin was a pumpkin pie recipe. And it also called for Libby's evaporated milk. You get like a little twofer. So I think the simplicity of being able to buy a lot of these prepared ingredients instead of buying the squash, roasting it yourself, scooping it out, mashing it down, was kind of a siren song too great for many home bakers at the time who were preparing these larger Christmas feasts. And so pumpkin pie really kind of takes over as the kind of pie of choice. So this is an image from our collection of that modernistic recipe menu book that I pulled the squash pie recipe from. And so here is a picture of the pie, the squash pie. Now I used, because Jessie recommends a yellow hard-shelled squash, so I used delicata squash. It was native to North America, so I figured it was something that was familiar to the New England area, and it was also hugely popular in the 1920s. So you all have a slice of that squash pie. So if you would like to sample it and give it a try. She just called for cinnamon and ginger in the pie recipe, so it's missing some of those other pumpkin spices, pumpkin pie spices that you might add into yours. Someone commented on Zoom that in the Southeast, sweet potato pie is much more common. And again, I think that kind of goes back to what is locally grown as well.
It's delicious, and I don't think I would know it wasn't pumpkin pie if you didn't tell us.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's really very similar. I mean, I think it's a little creamier.
Yes, it might be. But it's very light and delicious.
Mhm.
It is a very light pie. And I was actually kind of surprised the first time I made this because I was really afraid it wouldn't bake up. Because normally in any kind of custard recipe, you have a flour or you have cornstarch or you have something to act as a better thickening agent.
Yes.
This one doesn't call for that. So it's milk, it's brown sugar, it's eggs, roasted squash of whatever variety you like. I would think butternut squash would be very good.
I would think so.
I've also been, the question just popped up, is pumpkin in the squash family? It is, but not every pumpkin is a good edible squash to use. So if you're making a pumpkin pie or any baked good from a pumpkin, you don't want to use like a jack-o'-lantern style big pumpkin thinking, oh, I'm going to get much more pumpkin for my money. It is very stringy. You're really not going to get a lot of flavor in it. So you really need to find those little sugar pie pumpkins that are often sold during the Thanksgiving holiday, but you need a lot of them. And actually, Libby has developed its own squash called a Dickinson squash. So that's what they actually use in those cans of pureed pumpkin that you can buy from Libby's in the store. So I kind of like this a little bit more. I think you could add a lot more seasonings to it, a lot more flavors to it. I would probably up the ginger a bit and add a little nutmeg to it. Also, I really like cardamom a lot now. So I've been putting cardamom in a lot of baked goods. And black pepper.
I actually like the fact that it's not too sweet and it's a little more savory.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely, I also like the texture a little bit better than pumpkin pie. So like you say, a lot creamier.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's very light and creamy.
Yeah, it really helps to kind of, especially as that ending dish, you don't want a very heavy custardy dessert.
Don't say that when we've got the next item.
Well, the next thing I am very much looking forward to. So we've already sampled 4 out of our 5 holiday treats and beverages. So I think it's time now to wish you all a very Merry Christmas as I turn things over to Janet, who's going to be sharing with us a little history of the holiday tune as well as the food mention item that's mentioned in the lyrics. So now we're going to head over for some Christmas pudding.
Okay. Well, the carol, We Wish You a Merry Christmas, is a traditional English Christmas carol from the West Country of England, which happens to be my part of England, where I grew up. The words include, good tidings we bring to you and your kin. We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Now bring us some figgy pudding. Now bring us some figgy pudding. Now bring us some figgy pudding. Now bring some out here. Although the origin of this carol is lost in antiquity, the famous version was made popular by Arthur Worrell, who you see there, who arranged it for his madrigal singers at the University of Bristol in 1935. The origin of the carol probably lies in the tradition of wealthy people giving treats, including figgy pudding, to carolers on Christmas Eve. So the carolers demand some figgy pudding, and in the next verse threaten to not go until we get some. Before we go any further, I think we first have to sort out some of the terminology. In England, any dessert is referred to as a pudding. Whoops, there we go. Pudding originally indicated how a dish was cooked. It was steamed or boiled in a cloth or in a bowl. This could be a sweet pudding, like Christmas pudding, or a savory pudding, such as steak and kidney pudding. As sweet puddings were more common than savory, it became usual in England to refer to an after-meal dessert as a pudding. Growing up in England, we always referred to the pudding we ate at the conclusion of Christmas dinner as Christmas pudding. But what about plum pudding? Plum pudding has its origins in medieval England. In pre-Victorian days, the word plum meant raisin. So yes, plum pudding is the same as Christmas pudding. It does not contain plums, but it does contain raisins. But the Christmas carol quoted talks of figgy pudding. Is that the same as Christmas pudding? No, figgy pudding was a precursor of Christmas pudding. It contained figs, and it was not as rich or as complex a recipe as Christmas pudding. However, in the Christmas carol that we're discussing, the figgy pudding referred to a raisin pudding or Christmas pudding, and not necessarily a pudding containing figs. So, how did I make my Christmas pudding? First, I should mention that traditionally Christmas pudding was made using suet. After I came to the US, I had difficulty obtaining suet, and it's not a very healthy fat, so I changed the recipe and substituted butter instead. All the ingredients were mixed together in a bowl. Then traditionally, everyone in the family gave the mixture a stir and made a wish. Of course, you shouldn't tell anyone what you wished for, or the wish might not come true. At this point, traditionally, silver coins or charms were added to the mixture for diners to find as they ate their pudding. The charms all had meaning, indicating the fortune that was to be yours in the coming year. You will see that there was, for example, a wishbone for good luck, and a bell indicating an upcoming betrothal. The mixture was then put in a pudding basin, covered with wax paper, and then a clean pudding cloth. The cloth was tied around the pudding and finally over the top. The pudding was then put in a saucepan with water coming halfway up the side of the bowl and boiled for 4 to 6 hours. When the pudding was cool, I removed the damp cloth, put a fresh piece of wax paper over the original wax paper, and tied the pudding with a clean cloth. On the day of serving, today, it was steamed for a further 3 hours, turned out onto a plate, and decorated with a sprig of holly. Warm brandy was then poured over it, and it was lighted to bring to the table for serving. Finally, the pudding will be served with brandy butter, called hard sauce in this country. I'd like to conclude with a bit of trivia. Not far from the Homestead Museum is a county park with a lake called Puddingstone Lake. Apparently, a group of ladies hiked to a waterfall in the area in 1888, before the dam was built to form the lake. They found some rock in the area that reminded them of raisins in a Christmas pudding. So they named the waterfall Puddingstone Falls. The dam was built in 1928, forming what we now call Puddingstone Lake. So now it's time to taste the Christmas pudding, plum pudding or figgy pudding, as in the Christmas carol, and see what it tastes like. And we wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, as the carol says. Okay, so I'm afraid that this dessert is probably a little on the heavy side, but try and see what you think. And we have added a scoop of hard sauce brandy butter to the pudding.
All right. I'm very excited to taste this. I've never had a true traditional Christmas pudding. Some of the comments while you were speaking, Janet, was that's such a long cooking time to make something like this. And it seems like a lot of work.
Well, of course, as long as you're around to make sure it doesn't run out of water, you don't have to do anything for the 6 hours that it cooks for. I would have thought that was partly because of the suet originally. The recipe I use, which uses butter instead, still says to cook it for 4 to 6 hours, depending on how big the pudding basin is.
Okay. Alex wrote, it's a lot like the English version of tamale making.
Is that right? I've never done that. We'll have to do that next year.
It's a long process.
Okay.
The molasses is the first thing that I taste in this. That is
Sure.
really, really good.
Yeah.
I'm typically not a fan of raisins, but I don't mind it at all in this because I think they really just impart a sweetness, which is very
Yeah, and
good.
it has raisins and what in this country we call golden raisins and currants in it, and candied peel. And this year I made my own candied peel for the first time, but I think it could have had a little more in it probably.
I just got a nice bite of candied peel, actually. So I just got a nice burst of orange.
Good.
That was very good. This brandy butter is insane.
Yes. It's very easy. It doesn't take a long time like the pudding.
This is
How do you make brandy butter? Because that is delicious.
It's just creamed butter and confectioner's sugar, a tablespoon or two of, well, a little salt, a tablespoon or two of brandy added to it. And then my recipe optionally lets you add an egg or add some cream. And for years I added an egg. Now, of course, we aren't supposed to eat eggs that aren't cooked. So I added a little cream to it as well.
That is really good. One of the questions we just had was, I wonder what an undercooked Christmas pudding is like. So does it just fall flat if it's not cooked properly, or?
Do you know, having always cooked it for a long time like that, I don't know. And it is always, I've found it's not difficult to get it out of the pudding basin. We did it today and it came out very nicely. It is difficult to cut it into slices. It tends to crumble as you cut it up.
Gotcha.
But I don't think it tastes any different, so that's fine.
No, it's really, really yummy. It is really yummy.
Oh,
another question was, what is candied peel? So could you describe the process of making the candied peel?
Oh goodness, I'll have to look it back up again. But the time-consuming process, and the thing I should have done more of, was the original cutting up of the peel, because you have to, with a sharp knife, cut it off. I think it called for 1 grapefruit, 4 oranges, 2 lemons for you to cut the peel off. And that was very time consuming, because then it had to be cut in thin strips and then cut into smaller, like inch long pieces. So that was the part that took the longest. But then it's boiled with sugar on several different days. The whole process took me 2 weeks. I don't know whether all.
Oh my word.
Because in the end, for 4 or 5 days, it's spread out on a sheet and let dry. So basically, it's coated with a lot of sugar and then eventually dried out so that it would keep a long time.
But the texture of the peel gets very soft, which is nice, because then you can almost snack on it like candy.
Yes, I think you could actually. Yes.
Yeah, I've made hot cross buns once.
Oh yes.
And it also called for a candied peel. So
oh, okay.
I'm glad
did
I
you
read
make
the recipe early so I could figure out how to make it.
So yeah, well, usually I buy it, but I do have some gluten-free people in my family, and I have been unable to, although all the dried fruit I can get gluten-free, I have not been able to find candied peel that's gluten-free. And my daughter made some last year, so I thought, well, if she could do it, I could. So I gave it a try this year. Yeah.
No, that is very delicious. Robert,
Well,
what do you think?
you
You've been very quiet through this, Robert. Are you just enjoying the?
Well,
Yeah.
it's just like, I think when I've been very lucky to have several of these that Janet has made over the years. And my family's like really big into fruitcake, and I just don't like fruitcake. So when she first told me what was in it, I was like, oh no, it's like a hot, steamy fruitcake. It's so not like that. I thought it would be a lot more dense when I first had it. It's actually quite light for what's in it, in my opinion. But Janet, I think because I've had it with the store-bought citrus peel, yours is way better. Way better. A lot more flavor to it. And I mean, seriously, Jenny, you could use that hard sauce on like cinnamon toast, and it's amazing.
Oh yes. Yeah, I think you could use it on all sorts of things, mince pies maybe. And
Janet also makes amazing mince pie as well.
Oh, that would be me. It's almost like the best version of a buttercream frosting that you could have.
I
mean,
hate to
because
tell you,
it's-
Jenny, take a bite of the figgy pudding and then chase it with the smoking bishop, and it actually make the smoking bishop taste better.
Okay, let me give that a try here.
Sweetens it up quite a bit.
That's actually, yeah. Because
Yeah,
these
right?
can really dry. And now that my orange slice and stuff is sat in there for a little bit,
Yeah.
I get that is a traditional English Christmas feast. I think right
Indeed.
there. Now I understand why these are being mentioned in these kind of holiday classics.
So,
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Janet. That
well,
It's
you're
really
welcome. It was
delicious.
fun. Yeah.
So that actually takes us all to the end of our program today. Thank you all so very much for joining us. If anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to email either Robert or I.